Before we begin, if stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing and leaving a comment below. Every view tells platforms like this that these stories deserve to be heard. There is a file somewhere in a South Carolina county courthouse. It contains a name, a booking number, and a cause of death. For months, that file sat largely undisturbed, buried beneath administrative routine. But families rarely accept silence. And lawyers rarely stop pulling threads. What emerged from that file would eventually cost the county government over $1 million. More importantly, it would force a reckoning with a question that jails across America quietly dread. What happens to the mentally ill when the system that holds them also neglects them? His name has passed through courtroom documents and legal filings. He was not a violent man. He was a sick one. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, he existed at the margins of a world that had little infrastructure for people like him. Schizophrenia is not a character flaw. It is not a moral failure. It is a severe, chronic brain disorder that distorts reality, fractures thought, and requires consistent, careful medical management. Without treatment, the consequences can be catastrophic. For him, the catastrophe came inside a South Carolina jail. The details of how he ended up detained are, in themselves, and remarkable by American standards. Jails in the United States hold roughly 750,000 people on any given day. A significant portion of those individuals carry mental health diagnoses. Many are already in crisis. Many are already medically fragile. The question jails must answer legally, ethically, constitutionally, is what happens next. Do they receive care? Do they receive observation? Do they receive basic human dignity? In this case, investigators and attorneys would later argue the answer was a devastating no. South Carolina summers are relentless. The humidity presses against everything. Inside county detention facilities, the air sits differently than outside. There is a particular stillness to institutional spaces: concrete walls, steel doors, fluorescent ceilings that hum without warmth. For someone managing reality clearly, such an environment is difficult. For someone whose mind is already fragmenting, it can become something far worse: the lawsuit that would eventually produce a $135 million partial settlement used a specific phrase. That phrase was gross medical neglect. Not negligence in some minor administrative sense. Gross neglect. The kind of language that implies something visible, something documented, something that should have triggered intervention long before it did not. Attorneys representing the family alleged that warning signs were present and ignored. They alleged that his deteriorating condition was observable to staff. They alleged that the medical infrastructure inside that facility failed him at the most fundamental level. The county, for its part, reached a financial settlement, which in civil litigation typically implies no formal admission of wrongdoing. But money tells its own story. $2 million is not written carelessly. This documentary does not claim to know every truth inside those walls. What it does is follow the evidence, the documents, and the human cost of what investigators called institutional failure, somewhere between a booking desk and a final breath. A man with schizophrenia was lost. This is the story of how, and why, and what it means. Inside any detention facility, there is an official version of events. It lives in logbooks, incident reports, and medical intake forms. It is written in careful, institutional language and measured, passive, bureaucratic. Then there is what actually happened. The distance between those two versions is often where the truth lives. When investigators and attorneys began reconstructing the final weeks of his detention, they were working largely from paper. Medical logs, observation records, staff shift reports, documents that are designed, in theory, to create accountability. But documents can also be written to protect the institution that generates them. That tension between transparency and self-preservation sits at the heart of cases like this. 1. Schizophrenia, left untreated, does not remain static. It escalates, it cycles, it dismantles the architecture of a person's inner world piece by piece. Individuals in acute psychotic episodes may stop eating, they may stop drinking water. They may become unable to communicate their needs in ways that institutional staff recognize or respond to. They may appear difficult, uncooperative, or simply invisible within a system designed to process people rather than treat them. The legal filings in this case paint a portrait of deterioration. Not sudden, catastrophic collapse, but a slow, visible unraveling that allegedly went unaddressed. Attorneys argued that his condition was observable, that it should have triggered intervention under basic standards of jail medical care. The Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Federal courts have interpreted that to include deliberate indifference to serious medical needs of incarcerated individuals. Schizophrenia, by any clinical or legal standard, qualifies as a serious medical need. The medical infrastructure of county jails across America is a fractured landscape. Some facilities contract with private healthcare companies to manage inmate medical services. Others rely on minimal in-house staff with limited psychiatric resources. Either model can fail, and often does, when the volume of mentally ill detainees exceeds the system's capacity or commitment to care. South Carolina, like many states, has documented long-standing gaps in jail-based mental health services. Those gaps are not secrets. They appear in state audits, advocacy reports, and prior litigation. They persist anyway. People who work inside jails, correctional officers, medical staff, administrators exist under enormous pressure. Overcrowding is routine. Understaffing is chronic. Resources are finite. This documentary does not suggest that every individual inside that facility acted with malice. Institutional failure is often more diffuse and more dangerous than individual cruelty. It is built into schedules and staffing ratios, into budget lines and administrative priorities. It lives in the gap between policy and practice. It thrives in environments where oversight is limited and accountability is distant. What the walls of that facility witnessed during his detention, only records and surviving witnesses can suggest. Attorneys alleged that deterioration was visible, that distress signals were present, that somewhere in the machinery of daily jail operations, a man in psychiatric crisis was processed rather than treated, that the documentation trail, when examined closely, revealed not careful monitoring but something closer to neglect by inertia. A $2.135 million settlement does not emerge from a case without substantial documented evidence. Civil attorneys do not take contingency cases where they only profit if they win, without believing the evidence supports their claims. The settlement figure itself, legal observers note, implies significant liability exposure. It implies that the county's own legal counsel recognized the risk of what a jury might conclude. But settlements close courtroom doors. They prevent the full public examination of evidence that trials produce. They allow institutions to move forward without formal findings of wrongdoing on the official record. For families, that silence can feel like a second injustice layered quietly over the first. His family wanted answers that a financial figure could not provide. They wanted someone to explain, plainly and on the record, what happened inside those walls. That explanation, in any complete form, never fully came. There is a particular kind of institutional silence that only breaks under legal pressure. It does not volunteer information. It does not reach out to families. It waits. It files. It responds through attorneys. In South Carolina, that silence held for a significant period before the weight of litigation forced it open. Then, civil lawsuit, filed on behalf of his family, alleged something that legal language struggles to fully contain. It alleged that a human being with diagnosed, vulnerable, mentally ill man was placed inside a county facility and left to deteriorate without adequate medical intervention. The phrase used in filings, gross medical neglect, carries specific legal weight. Gross negligence in American civil law implies conduct that goes beyond carelessness. It implies a conscious disregard for the safety and well-being of another person. It implies that reasonable alternatives existed and were not taken. To understand what that means in practice, consider what adequate jail psychiatric care looks like. It means intake screening that flags mental health history accurately and completely. It means access to psychiatric medication for individuals with documented diagnoses. It means monitoring protocols for detainees whose conditions place them at elevated medical risk. It means staff trained to recognize psychiatric decompensation, the visible signs that a person's mental state is dangerously worsening. It means escalation pathways that move a deteriorating individual toward emergency medical care before crisis becomes catastrophe. Attorneys allege that one or more of those systems failed in this case. The specific details of exactly where and how remained, in significant part, shielded by the settlement process. But the architecture of failure in cases like this one tends to follow recognizable patterns. Intake screening that underreports, medication continuity that breaks down, observation logs that record presence without recording condition. Medical staff stretched too thin across too many cases to give adequate attention to the most vulnerable. County government that oversees the facility entered into a $2.135 million partial settlement. The word partial carries meaning here. Partial settlements suggest that litigation may not be entirely concluded. They suggest that multiple parties or multiple claims may remain in various stages of legal resolution. They suggest that the full financial and institutional accounting of what occurred may still be incomplete. For context, $2.135 million is a significant sum for a county government in South Carolina. It is money that comes, ultimately, from public funds and from taxpayers who may have no knowledge of what occurred inside a facility that operates in their name. Settlements of this scale in jail medical neglect cases are not routine. They reflect cases where the documented evidence was serious enough and the institutional exposure significant enough to make a trial outcome genuinely unpredictable. His family, in the aftermath of the settlement, faced a reality that money cannot resolve. Grief does not have a dollar value. Neither does the loss of a person's remaining years. He was someone's son, possibly someone's brother, a person with a history, a diagnosis, and a life lived at the difficult edge of mental illness in America. He was also, from the moment of his booking, a person with constitutional rights that his family's attorneys argued were systematically violated inside a facility paid for by the public. And yet the institution continues to operate. The same walls stand. The same corridors hold new detainees. Whether the internal policies and practices that allegedly contributed to his death have genuinely changed remains an open, uncomfortable question. The settlement closed the courtroom door, but it could not close the question of what is still happening right now inside facilities exactly like this one across the country. Who else is deteriorating in silence? Who else is filing observation logs that record presence but not pain? And what will it take beyond another settlement, another family, another death, for something to finally change? America has a complicated, often painful relationship with mental illness and incarceration. It is a relationship built not on intention but on institutional drift. Decades of policy decisions, funding cuts, and social neglect created a pipeline that moves the most vulnerable people not toward treatment, but toward detention. In the 1960s and 1970s, the United States underwent a dramatic shift in how it managed severe mental illness. Large state psychiatric hospitals were systematically closed or downsized in a process called deinstitutionalization. The theory was humane in its original framing. Community-based care would replace institutional warehousing. The reality was that the community infrastructure never fully materialized. The hospitals closed. The funding for alternatives largely did not follow. What filled the vacuum was, in significant part, the criminal justice system. Jails and prisons became, by default, the largest psychiatric facilities in the United States. The 2016 report from the Treatment Advocacy Center estimated that there were 10 times more seriously mentally ill individuals in jails and prisons than in state psychiatric hospitals. 10 times more. That statistic is not an accident. It is the accumulated result of policy failures spanning multiple generations. South Carolina sits within this national landscape. The state has faced documented criticism for gaps in its community mental health infrastructure. Advocacy organizations have raised concerns in various reports over the years about the adequacy of psychiatric services available to low-income and uninsured residents. For individuals like him, diagnosed with schizophrenia, likely navigating life without stable resources. The path to a jail cell rather than a treatment facility follows a tragically familiar route: a mental health crisis in public. An interaction with law enforcement. An arrest, or a welfare hold, or a situation that the responding officers felt required detention rather than diversion: a booking desk, a holding cell, a facility not designed or adequately resourced to provide psychiatric care. That sequence plays out thousands of times across America every week. Crisis intervention training, known as CIT, exists to help law enforcement officers recognize psychiatric emergencies and respond with diversion rather than arrest. It is considered best practice. It is not universally implemented. Mental health courts exist in many jurisdictions to redirect eligible individuals toward treatment rather than incarceration. They are not universally accessible. They are not always adequately funded. Jail diversion programs exist. Crisis stabilization units exist. The infrastructure is present in theory and fractured in practice. Inside jails, the medical standard governing mental health care derives largely from constitutional interpretation. The Supreme Court's 1976 ruling in Estelle v. Campbell established that deliberate indifference to serious medical needs of prisoners constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. That ruling is nearly 50 years old, and yet litigation alleging deliberate indifference to jail mental health needs continues to fill federal court dockets across the country. The standard exists on paper. The gap between paper and practice remains vast. Private healthcare contractors who manage medical services in many jails operate under financial incentives that do not always align with comprehensive patient care. Minimizing costs can mean minimizing services. Minimizing services for a population that cannot advocate loudly for itself means that deterioration can go unaddressed for far longer than it should. He entered that South Carolina facility as a number in a system, a booking number, a case file, a bed assignment. His schizophrenia diagnosis existed somewhere in the paperwork. Whether that paperwork translated into adequate monitoring, medication continuity, and genuine clinical attention is precisely what the litigation alleged it did not. The system that swallows people rarely announces what it has done. It generates documentation. It holds reviews. It reaches settlements. And then, quietly, it continues. The next person with schizophrenia is booked at the same desk, assigned to the same corridor, watched or not watched by the same institutional machinery that allegedly failed the man before him. Asterisk. When institutional systems fail visibly enough to produce litigation, something else quietly begins. People start to talk. Not always loudly, not always on the record, but in the margins of court filings, in the statements of advocates, in the carefully worded testimonies of those willing to speak. The counter-narrative begins to form. Civil rights attorneys who specialize in jail and prison conditions describe a consistent pattern. Families, they say, often know something is wrong before the institution acknowledges anything at all. Phone calls become shorter, then more distressed, then stop. Visitation reveals a person who looks different, thinner, more withdrawn, more frightened, more lost inside themselves. Families raise concerns. They call the facility. They speak to whoever answers. Often, they are reassured. Often, that reassurance is the last communication before a crisis. Mental health advocacy organizations across South Carolina and nationally have documented what they describe as a systemic inadequacy in how jails respond to psychiatric emergencies. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, has consistently identified jails as among the most dangerous environments for individuals with untreated severe mental illness, not because of other inmates necessarily, but because of the institutional indifference that severe mental illness can encounter when it intersects with a corrections environment designed for containment, not care. Former correctional officers, speaking in various contexts over the years, have described the impossible position that understaffed facilities create. They are not, many know, trained psychiatric nurses. They are corrections professionals managing large populations with limited resources. When a detainee's behavior becomes difficult to interpret, is this a psychiatric crisis or a disciplinary problem? The institutional default often trends toward discipline rather than diagnosis. That default can be lethal for someone in acute psychotic decompensation. Medical professionals who have worked inside jail systems describe a different kind of pressure. Contract medical providers operate within the boundaries set by their agreements with county governments. Those agreements have limits on staffing levels, on psychiatric consultation access, on the availability of medications, on the speed of emergency referrals. A medical professional who identifies a patient in crisis may face institutional barriers to acting on that identification, barriers of authorization, of cost, of bureaucratic process that moves slower than deterioration. In cases of this nature, the question of who bears legal and moral responsibility becomes genuinely complex. Is it the individual correctional officer who may or may not have recognized the signs? Is it the medical contractor who may or may not have responded adequately? Is it the county administration that sets staffing levels and budget allocations? Is it the state government that funds or fails to fund a community mental health alternatives that might have intercepted him before detention? Litigation tends to name specific defendants, but the failure, in cases like this, is rarely located in a single decision by a single person. His family's attorneys constructed a case from documents, from records, from the institutional paper trail that jails generate. They argued that the trail showed not a sudden, unforeseeable tragedy, but a slow, visible, preventable one. They argued that the warning signs were present and observable, that the standards of care, legal, medical, constitutional, required a response that allegedly never came. Somewhere in the process, advocates argue, there should have been a moment of intervention, a nurse who escalated, a supervisor who ordered a psychiatric referral, a protocol that transferred him to a medical facility equipped to stabilize his condition. That moment, if it existed at all in any meaningful form, came too late. The voices that speak against institutional walls do so knowing the limits of what they can change. Settlements are reached, policies are quietly amended, training programs are announced, and then the next case enters the system. Another family begins making phone calls that go unanswered. Another set of observation logs begins recording presence without recording pain. The advocates, the attorneys, the former staff willing to speak, they share one consistent, weary conclusion. The system does not change because of individual cases alone. It changes when it changes at all, because enough cases accumulate that the political and financial cost of inaction finally exceeds the cost of reform. That threshold in American jail mental health care has not yet clearly been reached. Settlements and lawsuits, they do not end stories. The legal process has a finish line, a signed agreement, a transferred sum, a case marked closed. But for families who have lost someone to institutional neglect, the finish line is a different kind of beginning. The beginning of living with what happened, and with what was never fully explained. The $2.135 million partial settlement in this case represents, in legal terms, a resolution. In human terms, it represents something far more ambiguous. It represents a county government calculating risk and choosing financial settlement over courtroom exposure. It represents attorneys for a grieving family accepting that a trial, with all its uncertainty and emotional costs, was not the only path to some form of accountability. It represents a number assigned to a life, and to a death, and to everything that allegedly went wrong in between. He was a man with schizophrenia navigating a world poorly designed for people like him. That is not a simple sentence. It carries the weight of decades of policy failure, funding neglect, and institutional indifference. Schizophrenia affects approximately 24 million people worldwide, according to the World Health Organization. In the United States, individuals with severe mental illness are disproportionately represented in homeless populations, in poverty statistics, and in incarceration figures. They are among the most vulnerable people in any society. They are also among the least politically powerful, least able to advocate loudly for themselves, least likely to generate sustained public attention when they are failed. What does accountability look like when the system that failed someone continues to operate largely unchanged? It is a question that civil rights advocates, mental health professionals, and bereaved families return to repeatedly. Financial settlements, they note, do not by themselves mandate policy reform. They do not require the facility to hire Additional psychiatric staff. They do not require the county to invest in mental health diversion programs. They do not require the medical contractor to revise its monitoring protocols. Those changes, if they happen at all, happen through separate mechanisms, through regulatory pressure, through legislative action, through sustained public scrutiny. In the years since cases like this one have accumulated in American civil litigation, some progress has occurred. Some jurisdictions have expanded crisis intervention training for law enforcement. Some counties have invested in mental health courts and jail diversion programs. Some facilities have revised their medical contractor agreements to include stronger psychiatric care requirements. The progress is real. It is also uneven, underfunded, and insufficient relative to the scale of the problem. For every jurisdiction that has reformed, there is another where the same patterns persist, where mentally ill detainees arrive at booking desks and enter institutional machinery that was not built to heal them, where observation logs continue to record presence without recording pain. Where families continue to make phone calls that reveal a loved one unraveling on the other side of a wall they cannot cross. His name deserves to be more than a case number in a settlement document. It deserves to be part of a larger conversation, one that this country has been reluctant to have with the honesty it requires. Conversation about what it means to detain human beings who are mentally ill. About what constitutional obligations actually require in practice, not just in legal theory. About who bears responsibility when the gap between those two things costs a person their life. The facility still stands. South Carolina's county jails continue to receive detainees, including detainees with serious mental illness, every single day. The systems that allegedly failed him are not unique to one county or one state. They are woven into the fabric of how America manages the intersection of mental illness, poverty, and the criminal justice system. That fabric does not change quickly. It does not change without sustained pressure, but it has changed before. When enough people refuse to accept the silence, there is a file somewhere in a South Carolina county courthouse. It contains a name, a booking number, a cause of death, and now the settlement figure. What it cannot contain is the full weight of what was lost, or the full weight of what remains to be answered. If stories like this one matter to you, if you believe that the invisible and the vulnerable deserve witnesses, then stay with us. There are more stories, more files, more names behind the numbers. And as long as they exist, so does the obligation to look clearly at what they contain.